Thea made it back to the apartment in Pilsen at 4 o'clock in the morning, climbed 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken again, and unlocked the wooden door with blue paint peeling away at 3 corners. Inside, the smell of cheap soap and dried flowers left over from the daytime shift mingled with the cold air of a room that never had enough heat. 2 rooms, an old sofa covered with a plaid wool blanket washed so many times it had faded pale, a small oak dining table her father had built by hand when Thea was 12 years old, and a table lamp with a broken stem bound together with black tape. She sat down on the sofa without taking off her coat, without removing her shoes, and placed the thick cotton calling card on her lap. Under the dim yellow light of the table lamp, the embossed silver eagle stood out so clearly that she could count every feather in its wings, and the name Caspar Varga had been printed in the kind of lithographic ink Thea had learned to recognize back when she was still investigating document fraud. This wasn't the kind of card printed in bulk. This was the kind of card made by hand by an artisan in Milan or Vienna, on private commission, each one costing no less than $100. She took out her phone, opened the browser, and typed the name into the search bar. The first results all followed the same pattern. No clear portrait photographs, only a few distant shots of him coming out of a hotel or a courtroom where he wasn't the defendant. A few articles from the Chicago Tribune mentioned his name alongside 3 others in that half-finished tone Thea knew too well, the tone of reporters who wanted to write something but understood exactly what would happen if they wrote it plainly. 1 article from 2020, 1 from 2022, 1 from a few months ago. All 3 ended with the same sentence in slightly different wording. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office declined to comment. Thea locked her phone and placed the card on the dining table, printed side facing the ceiling. She lifted her head and looked at the wall above the table. There, in a small wooden frame, she herself had nailed onto the wall on the first night she moved into this apartment 4 years ago, was the letter terminating her employment with Harrogate Mutual, yellowed now at the 4 corners, Cyrus Thorne's signature dark and bold at the bottom. Beside that letter, in a tarnished brass frame, was a photograph of her father, Inspector Evander Whitlock, Chicago Police Department, Pilsen District, dressed in a dark blue uniform, holding his cap in one hand, smiling faintly toward the camera, in the way men of his generation didn't know how to smile broadly. The photograph had been taken 6 years and 3 months ago. It was the last image of him before the stroke that took him 2 weeks after she was fired by Harrogate. She remembered with painful clarity the evening before he died. He had sat on this very sofa, holding the cup of chamomile tea Thea had made for him, and he had spoken to her in the voice of a police officer who had worked 30 years in a city where the line between law and lawlessness was sometimes thinner than a sheet of paper. "Daughter, don't ever trust a man whose name is in the papers, but whose face isn't. A man whose face is there can be summoned to court. A man whose face isn't there can't be found for anyone to summon." Thea hadn't fully understood that sentence when she was 21. She understood more of it at 22, when her name was put in the papers in place of someone else's. And she understood it completely now, as she looked at the card on the table and realized that Caspar Varga had a name in 3 articles but no face in a single photograph. She slept for 2 hours on the sofa, without ever lying fully flat. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Thea woke up, changed into the white blouse she had washed 3 nights earlier, tied her hair back, and took the bus to Petal and Pine Flower Shop at the corner of 18th Street and Halsted. The owner, Delphine Ashe, had already opened the door. The morning shift passed like every other morning shift. Thea wrapped 7 bouquets, trimmed branches for 12 pots, and rinsed out water buckets 3 times. At noon, Delphine handed her the weekly pay envelope, $192 in cash. Thea counted it, folded it, slipped it into the pocket of her coat, and walked out to the corner to make a call. She called Oakwood. The nurse on duty said that Mira had been lucid today, had eaten all her breakfast, and had asked about the daughter who brought flowers. Thea thanked the nurse, ended the call, leaned back against the cold brick wall of the nearby cafe, and let out a long breath. At 3:52 in the afternoon, Thea stepped off the bus in Bucktown, walked past 2 rows of houses, and stopped in front of the black oak door of the Ivy Room. The brass sign had tarnished so deeply it was nearly black, and only 2 words could still be read if a person stood at exactly the right angle. There was no menu posted outside, no advertising lights. Only a man about 6 feet tall in a black sweater standing in the doorway, his hands folded in front of his stomach, looking at Thea with the eyes of someone who had been told in advance exactly what she looked like. He gave the slightest nod. Miss Whitlock, the boss is waiting. The man in the black sweater opened the door for Thea with a motion that was neither quick nor slow, and the moment she stepped inside, the whole outside world was left behind on the other side of that oak door. The Ivy Room wasn't like any restaurant in Chicago Thea had passed in her 4 years of working in Pilsen. The dark oak floor had worn into soft curves beneath the footsteps of generations of regular patrons. The ceiling was low, paneled in walnut with carved details that had darkened from the smoke of an entire century. On the walls hung 6 oil paintings of the Hungarian plains and 2 antique maps of the city of Budapest, framed in tarnished brass. Brass lamps burned with the warm glow of tungsten bulbs, and the air carried the scent of roasted paprika. Black bread fresh from the oven, Tokaji wine opened 30 minutes earlier, and oak smoke drifting from the stove in the back. There was no background music, only the light clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation in 3 different languages, at 3 different tables, and the steady tick-tick of a wooden pendulum clock, standing in the corner like the beat of a heart. A silver-haired man was waiting for Thea in the middle of the room, his hands folded behind his back. He was about 62 years old, of average height, with the solid build of a man who hadn't exercised in years, but hadn't lost the strength he had built in his youth. He wore a dark gray wool suit cut in an old Italian style, a white shirt with no tie, and on the middle finger of his right hand was a silver ring engraved with an eagle smaller than the one on the card. He inclined his head by the smallest degree when she came close. "Miss Whitlock, I am August Kovac. The boss asked me to lead you in." His voice was low and slow, carrying the same faint Central European tone as Casper's, but heavier and older. The voice of a man who had used it since childhood, in a house in Budapest, before his family emigrated to Cleveland when he was 10 years old. He didn't offer her his hand. He only invited her forward with a gesture of his palm. And as Thea passed the tables draped in crisp white cloth, she noticed that his brown leather shoes had been polished until they reflected the brass lights above. The innermost table stood against the walnut wall, half hidden behind a silk screen embroidered with pomegranate motifs. Caspar Varga stood when she arrived. He was wearing a different suit from the night at the Drake Hotel, this time a deep navy so dark it was almost black, with a white shirt buttoned all the way to the collar and no tie. He pulled out her chair for her, sat across from her, and Gus silently withdrew to a small table about 4 yards away, where he sat alone with an espresso and never once looked in their direction. Though throughout the conversation Thea knew he was hearing every word. Caspar didn't order for her. He had already ordered. A cup of hot chamomile tea was brought within 30 seconds of her sitting down. Thea understood that this wasn't random courtesy. He already knew she didn't drink coffee after midday. She didn't ask how he knew. "Thank you for coming on time," he said. "Where did you learn sign language, Miss Whitlock?" Thea placed both hands in her lap. "From my mother. She lost hearing in one ear when she was 8 years old. I learned before I learned English." Caspar gave the slightest nod, as if that answer confirmed something he had suspected, but hadn't been certain of. He didn't ask anything more about her mother. He went straight to the reason for the meeting. "The boy last night was my nephew, Rowan Varga, 9 years old. 2 years ago, his father died in an incident he was there to witness. Since that night, he hasn't spoken a single word. 3 child psychologists, 5 specialists in 3 cities, 2 private sign language instructors brought into the house. No one has been able to get the boy to draw it, write it, or sleep through the night without nightmares." Caspar set down his espresso cup, his eyes never leaving her face. "Last night, he held onto your hand." Thea tightened her fingers around the teacup in her palms. "He hasn't held onto anyone's hand in 2 years, Miss Whitlock. Not even mine. I don't know why he chose you. I only know I have no right to ignore that." He paused for a beat. "I want to invite you to be his companion. Not a tutor, not a teacher, not therapy. Just someone who is there. You don't have to teach him anything. You don't have to heal him. You only have to live in the same house with him. Eat breakfast with him. Be in the room when he draws, and answer him when he wants to speak with his hands. $20,000 a month. Live in my estate in Lake Forest. Car service. Full health insurance. A 2-year contract." Thea didn't answer at once. She looked down at the tabletop, at the oak grain gone dark from the oil of thousands of coffee cups, and she thought of her mother. She thought of room 23 at Oakwood, where her mother had lived for the past 4 years. She thought of the debt of $4,000 a month she was paying off with 3 jobs, A debt that even a new salary of $20,000 wouldn't solve if she moved to Lake Forest, 45 minutes away by car. "Mr. Varga," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I truly appreciate your offer, but I can't leave my mother. She is at Oakwood Nursing Home. I visit her every Thursday and Sunday afternoon. If I move to Lake Forest, I won't be able to get there anymore." Casper didn't react. He didn't try to persuade her. He didn't frown. He only nodded once, as though he had just received a piece of information, not a refusal. "I understand," he said. "Thank you for coming. Gus will call a car for you." 3 days later, on Sunday morning, Thea's phone vibrated at 10 o'clock. Gus's voice, still slow, still low. "Miss Whitlock, the boss wishes to add to the terms. The full cost of your mother's nursing home care will be paid for life by a separate trust that won't bear his name. Medication. A private neurologist will examine her twice a week. A car will take you to visit her every day if you wish, with no limit. The offer remains open for 48 hours. Thea was silent for exactly 1 minute. She looked up at the wall above the table, at the yellowed termination letter, at her father's face in that blue uniform. "I agree," she said. Thea signed the contract on Wednesday morning the following week, in the office of an Austrian lawyer on the 32nd floor of the Aon Center, with Gus seated beside her and another attorney, arranged by Delphine Ash, the owner of Petal and Pine Flower Shop, there to review every clause line by line. The contract ran 21 pages. The clause concerning her mother ran 3.5 pages, with the trust named in full and 3 guarantor banks listed beneath it. Thea signed with her right hand, more decisively than she had imagined she would. On Friday afternoon, a black Mercedes picked her up outside the flower shop at 3 o'clock, drove her back to the apartment in Pilsen, so she could collect 1 small suitcase and a cardboard box containing her father's framed photograph and the termination letter. She didn't bring much. She had learned 6 years earlier that the most important things a person owned could fit inside 20 liters of space, and everything else was only baggage. The car left the city heading north, passed through Highland Park, passed through Lake Bluff, then turned onto a private road, pressed between 2 rows of ancient oak trees, whose branches met overhead to form a thick, dark green tunnel. At the end of the road stood a black iron gate, nearly 13 feet high, 2 stone pillars carved with the eagle emblem in relief, and a house Thea couldn't fully see until the car passed the final bend. It was a 3-story gray stone manor, built in the style of a French chateau, with steep black roofs and 6 chimneys, tall arched windows trimmed in white limestone, and ivy climbing almost to the 2nd floor on the side that faced Lake Michigan. There were no decorative lights, no topiary cut into the shapes of animals, only the silence of a place that had stood firm through 2 generations and didn't need to prove anything to anyone. A woman was already waiting on the stone steps, tall and thin, about 58 years old, with silver hair pulled tightly into a knot at the back of her head. She wore a dark gray knit dress that fell to mid-calf. On her wrist was an old silver watch whose second hand moved almost soundlessly. Elspeth Marlowe, housekeeper of the Varga estate for 26 years. Miss Whitlock. Her voice was dry and clear, not cold but not warm either. "I will show you around. The master is at his Chicago office and will return late tonight. Master Rowan is studying with his tutor this afternoon in the schoolroom on the 2nd floor. You will meet him at dinner." Thea followed her through the main hall, paved in cream-colored marble, through the 2-story library with its sliding brass ladder, through the formal dining room with its granite fireplace, and 3 bohemian crystal chandeliers lit with 200 low-watt electric candles, so that the entire room held the glow of a September afternoon. Elspeth walked very quickly. She didn't stop to explain a single painting or a single piece of furniture. She was moving along a route she had practiced dozens of times, and that pace told Thea that in this house there were things people only passed by. Then she stopped. At the end of the east wing corridor, in front of a pair of walnut doors, polished so brightly that Thea could see her own reflection on their surface. Elspeth didn't place a hand on the handle. She only stood about a step away from the doors, and for the first time during the entire tour, she hesitated for half a second before she spoke. "This is Petra's room," she said. "The master's sister. No one has stepped into this room since the night the girl went away. 15 years now." Thea looked at the doors. She didn't ask who Petra was. She didn't ask why Elspeth said went away instead of died. She understood, in that very instant, that in this house There were ways of using words that had been shaped by 15 years of one man whom she had met only 3 times. Thea's room was in the west wing, in the corridor opposite, directly across from Rowan's room. It was large, with a ceiling nearly 16 feet high, a 4-poster walnut bed with pale gray silk drapes, and arched windows looking down over the back garden, and a narrow, distant slice of Lake Michigan. Elspeth showed her the call bell, the heated floors, the bathroom, and the wardrobe where several linen dresses and wool sweaters were already waiting in sizes that fit so closely Thea didn't need to try them on. Then she left, closing the door very gently behind her. On the bedside table, between an empty picture frame and a small white ceramic vase holding a single stem of deep purple lavender, lay an envelope. Thick cotton paper like the calling card, but this time plain white, with no logo. Thea picked it up. 3 lines written by hand in black ink, in the same handwriting that slanted slightly to the right, the handwriting she had seen on the back of the calling card 4 days earlier. This room is yours. The door has a lock on the inside. No one is permitted to enter without your permission, including me, KV. Thea read it 3 times. She folded the note, set it back on the table, and walked to the door. She slid the lock into place from the inside. That night, Casper didn't appear. Thea sat on the bed, looked through the window at the garden darkening beneath the November sunset, and thought about the number 15. Thea slept for about 1 hour and 40 minutes. A shallow and broken sleep in which she dreamed that her mother was sitting at the dining table in the Pilsen apartment pouring tea for her father, but neither of them looked at her. She woke at 1:48 in the morning with the feeling of someone who had just heard her name called from the next room. Outside the window, a night wind off Lake Michigan was brushing softly against the glass, and beyond that were the shadows of ancient oak trees swaying in that blue-gray light through which no star was strong enough to break. She sat up, pulled on the gray wool robe hanging ready in the wardrobe, and unlatched her bedroom door. The west wing corridor was long and dark, lit only by brass wall lamps burning at the lowest possible glow, enough to show the way but not enough to make out a clock. She walked barefoot, because the oak floors were heated from below and felt warmer than the air. Rowan's room was directly across from hers. The door was shut. She didn't know whether the boy was asleep, and she didn't dare knock. She kept going, descended the main staircase to the first floor, and just as she passed the turn leading toward the back of the house, she saw a streak of yellow light spilling through the crack beneath the door of a room Elspeth had referred to the day before only as the drawing room. Thea stood still for 3 seconds. Then she stepped closer and pushed the door open very gently. The drawing room wasn't very large, only about 40 square meters, but the ceiling was high, and 3 walls were lined with oak shelves holding paper, oil paints, pencils, soft charcoal, and boxes of pastel sticks from European makers arranged neatly by color. In the center of the room stood a large pale oak drafting table, and beside it, under a brass lamp shaded with ivory linen, sat the boy cross-legged on a thick wool rug. Rowan Varga, 9 years old. His brown hair was cut short exactly as it had been the night at the Drake Hotel, but now he wore gray flannel pajamas embroidered with a small star over the left side of his chest. In front of him on the rug lay a sketchbook bound in brown leather, open to a blank page. In his right hand he held a sharpened 2B pencil. He wasn't drawing. He was only sitting there, staring at the page, with the pencil held exactly 1 centimeter above the paper. Thea recognized it at once as the posture of a child who had sat that way for months, perhaps years, and no one had known what to do. She didn't call to him. She didn't ask him anything. She simply entered the room on footsteps so soft that he didn't turn his head until she had already sat down about a yard away from him, also cross-legged on the rug, her back resting lightly against the leg of the drafting table. Rowan turned and looked at her with the gray-blue eyes Thea had seen in room 4721. But this time there was no fear in them, only the alert stillness of a child deciding what this grown-up would do next. He didn't sign. He only waited. Thea reached up to the drafting table, pulled a blank sheet of A4 paper from the stack at the edge, and took another pencil from the cup holding them. She placed the sheet on the rug between them. Then she bent over and drew. A simple rose, the stem curving slightly to the right, 3 leaves, petals opening just enough for anyone looking at it to know it was a rose without her needing to write the word beneath it. Her lines weren't the lines of an artist. They were the lines of a woman who had handled flowers every day for 4 years. Not on paper, but by trimming stems, by choosing buds, by setting the water to the right depth in a vase. She finished the drawing without shading it, without adding detail, and pushed the paper about half a yard toward the boy. Then she sat still and didn't look at him. She looked at the rug instead. Rowan stared at the flower for a long time. Thea counted nearly 2 minutes. Then he bent forward, set his own pencil to the edge of the paper, and began to draw, not over the flower, not beside it. He drew directly on the rose stem, at the curve between the thorn and the second leaf. A small bird. The precision of his line was startling for a 9-year-old child, the proportions of head to body exactly right, the beak angled just so, and one tiny detail Thea almost missed, that he had drawn one feather on the wing slightly lifted, as though the bird had just landed there, not been perched there for long. Thea said nothing. She only nodded once, very slightly, and pushed the sheet back to the center between them as a signal that now it belonged to both of them. Rowan looked at her. He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth had loosened by 0.5 millimeter, enough for Thea to know that something inside him had just opened, and that he himself didn't yet realize it. At that exact moment, Thea felt movement in the doorway behind her. She turned her head slowly. Casper was standing at the threshold of the drawing room, about 6 yards from where she sat. He wore a black turtleneck sweater and gray trousers, wool socks on his feet, and in his right hand he held a low crystal glass filled with amber whiskey that he hadn't taken a single sip from since pouring it. He didn't step inside. He didn't say a word. He only stood there, his shoulders resting lightly against the wooden frame, and looked at the scene in the room with the eyes of a man who hadn't seen what he was seeing now for 2 years. His gaze met Thea's. 3 seconds. Then he gave the smallest nod, one single nod, said nothing, and stepped back from the doorway, disappearing into the dark corridor. The sound of his stockinged footsteps faded and then disappeared completely. Thea stayed another 40 minutes in the drawing room with Rowan. When he began to yawn, she stood before he did, bent to pick up the sheet with the rose and the bird, slid it carefully inside his sketchbook, closed the cover, and handed it to him with both hands. He hugged the sketchbook to his chest. She walked him back to his bedroom, waited until he had climbed beneath the covers, and pulled the door nearly shut with the gentlest touch. When Thea returned to her own room in the west wing, she locked the door from the inside, sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in 6 years, she cried. Not from exhaustion, not because she missed her father, not because of her mother. She cried because of something she didn't yet have a name for, and because a child had drawn a bird onto the stem of her rose, and because the man who had stood in the doorway hadn't stepped inside. The next morning, Thea woke at 7:10 and came downstairs to the small dining room in the west wing, only to find that Casper had already left the estate 35 minutes earlier. Elspeth placed before her a plate of herb omelette, a slice of rye grain bread, and a cup of chamomile tea. The meal had been prepared for exactly one person. Master Rowan had breakfast at 7:30 and is now studying mathematics with his morning tutor in the schoolroom on the 2nd floor, she said. The master returned home after 10 o'clock last night. You will take dinner with Master Rowan in the small dining room this evening. Tell me if you have any special requests. That was the first day of a pattern that, for the next 3 weeks, kept Thea and Casper almost entirely from crossing paths. She heard the Bentley's wheels rolling over the gravel in the early mornings, sometimes the sound of the front door closing sometime after 10 at night, and that was the full extent of the evidence that another man was also living in this gray stone house. She spent the mornings with Rowan in the drawing room, not teaching, not pressing, only sitting beside him while he drew. In the afternoons, the Mercedes took her to Oakwood to visit her mother, and the car brought her back before 7 in the evening so she could have dinner with Rowan. But small things began to appear. On the first weekend, when Thea entered the drawing room at 9 in the morning, she realized that something had appeared on Rowan's drawing table that hadn't been there the night before. A long wooden box with a hinged lid, and inside it a set of 120 Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils. The professional edition, the kind even art schools in Chicago didn't always have fully stocked in their supply rooms. The pencils were completely new, not yet sharpened. Beside the box was a new sketchbook, made of 200-gram cotton paper, bound in black leather, the same kind as Rowan's old one but twice the size. Thea stood looking at it for 1 full minute. There was no message, no note. She didn't touch the pencil box. She only placed the blank stack of A4 paper she had used on that first night onto the table and waited for Rowan. When he entered the room after breakfast, he looked at the box of pencils, looked at Thea, then looked at the blank stack of paper. He picked up the blank paper, not the Polychromos set. That was how he answered. It was also how Thea realized that Casper had known exactly what she would do if the gift was too large for the moment. In the second week, on Thursday morning, Thea opened the wardrobe in her room to take out the milk beige wool coat she had brought with her from the apartment in Pilsen, the coat she had worn through 4 winters, and whose right elbow had worn nearly through. It was no longer there. In its exact place, hanging on the same hanger, was another coat, the same milk beige color, the same V-neck shape, and 3 wooden buttons, but made of hand-woven Mongolian cashmere, lined with silk, and in a size 36 that fit her shoulders exactly. Thea stood in front of the wardrobe for nearly 2 minutes. She didn't wear the new coat that day, but the next morning, when the temperature dropped to -2 degrees, she wore it. The silk lining was so warm that she realized it was the first time in 6 years she didn't feel cold on a Chicago morning. In the third week, on a Sunday night, when she returned to her room after dinner, she saw on the bedside table, between her father's framed photograph and the white ceramic vase, now holding a fresh-dried stem of lavender, a book, dark blue cloth cover, the spine stamped in gold, now slightly faded. Rebecca, by Daphne du Maurier, a Folio Society edition printed in 1997. The novel Thea had read 7 times in her life, the first time at 15, the last time at 21, 2 weeks before Harrogate dismissed her. She had never told anyone except Delphine Ashe that this was the only book she had carried with her throughout her life. Beside the book, on a small white porcelain dish, was another dried stem of lavender, its stalk wrapped in a gray silk ribbon. Thea didn't ask. Casper didn't speak. They didn't meet at breakfast, not at lunch, not at dinner. But by the end of the third week, when Thea stood before the mirror in her room one morning fastening the buttons of the new cashmere coat, she saw herself more clearly than she had in years, and she understood something that left her silent for half a minute. The man who had brought her into this house wasn't here, but he was reading her, very carefully, 1 page at a time. Elspeth told Thea about the Sunday dinner tradition on Friday morning of the third week, while she was folding linen napkins into the drawer of the small dining room sideboard. The former mistress of the house, meaning the current master's mother, had established the rule in 1996, she said in a voice that rose and fell not at all. Every Sunday evening, the family dines together in the main dining room, no matter how many people there are, no matter what has happened. She kept that tradition until the night before she died. The current master keeps it still. You will dine with Master Rowan and the master at 7 o'clock on Sunday evening, in the main dining room, not the small dining room. I will inform you if there is any change. There was no change. At 10 minutes to 7 on Sunday evening, Thea wore the dark gray knit dress she had found in her wardrobe during the second week, tied her hair low at the nape of her neck with a black velvet ribbon, and walked toward the main dining room along the corridor lined with Hungarian landscapes. The main dining room was 4 times larger than the small dining room in the west wing. The ceiling rose nearly 6 meters high. 2 bohemian crystal chandeliers burned at low power, and the granite fireplace was lit with real flames fed by dry oak logs. The walnut table stretched 10.5 feet long, 6 chairs upholstered in deep red velvet. 2 sets of white heroned porcelain painted with blue tulips had already been laid out, along with 2 Moser crystal wine glasses and 2 smaller glasses for water. 3 places were set. The north end of the table for Casper, Rowan to his right. The south end, 10 feet from Casper, was for Thea. Casper was already seated when she entered. He wore a dark gray shirt with no tie, the sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing a white gold watch on his wrist that Thea had never seen before. He stood when she came near, waited for her to sit, then sat again himself. Rowan was already in his chair, his hands in his lap, his eyes moving from his uncle to Thea and then back again, like a child studying 2 adults at once to understand what might be different tonight from all other nights. Elspeth brought out the main course. Hungarian beef goulash made according to Casper's grandmother's recipe. Beef shank braised for 5 hours in sweet paprika and hot paprika from Szeged, with Spanish yellow onions, red potatoes, roasted tomatoes, and a touch of caraway seed, served in deep white porcelain bowls with a slice of black bread just out of the oven. The scent of paprika and slow-cooked meat rose from the bowls in such a clear, thin veil that Thea could almost see it in front of her. The 3 of them began to eat in silence. There was no background music, no voices, only the soft sound of spoons striking horrend porcelain, the crackle of the fireplace, and the pendulum clock in the hallway outside counting each minute. Casper ate slowly and evenly, cutting the meat with fork and knife in the European style, never switching the knife to his right hand. Rowan ate too, slowly, each bite small, sometimes glancing at Thea. Thea managed 3 bites. Then she set down her spoon. She looked at Casper across the full 10 feet of walnut table. "Why did you hire me?" Her question landed on the table as clearly as a silver spoon striking porcelain. Rowan looked up. Casper set his knife and fork down in parallel along the edge of his bowl, very neatly. He dabbed the corner of his mouth with the linen napkin, folded it, and placed it beside his plate. Then he looked at Thea. Beneath the crystal chandeliers, his eyes were no longer steel gray. They were gray like smoke thinning into air, because my nephew smiled for the first time in 2 years when he looked at you. Thea tightened the napkin in her lap. "You said that already at the Ivy Room. I am asking why it was me. Why not one of the 10 specialists you hired before? Why not one of the 2 sign language instructors you brought into the house? Why a hotel housekeeper?" Casper didn't answer at once. He looked at Rowan, and Rowan, sensing something, lowered his head and resumed eating. Then Casper turned back to Thea. "Do you truly want the answer right now, Miss Whitlock?" Thea parted her lips, then closed them again. She realized in that very instant that if she said yes, she would trade a small piece she had only just begun to have over the past 3 weeks for a truth she didn't yet know whether she could bear. If she said no, she would have to live for an unknown length of time with that question still inside her. She didn't answer. Casper waited 4 seconds. Then he nodded, very slightly, as if he had just received an answer he had anticipated all along. 2 years from now, or sooner if you are ready, you will understand. Or perhaps you never will. Either is acceptable, Miss Whitlock. I won't ask anything of you that you aren't ready for." He rose from the table. He didn't look at the goulash, still 2/3 untouched in front of him. He bent and touched the top of Rowan's head very lightly, kissed his hair once without a sound, and moved toward the door. As he passed Thea, he paused for exactly half a second behind her chair, without touching her. "Enjoy your dinner, Miss Whitlock." Then he left. The dining room door closed very softly behind him. Thea remained with Rowan in the main dining room, beneath the 2 crystal chandeliers, beside the still-burning fireplace. She looked at the goulash before her. She looked at Rowan, who was eating slowly and not looking at her. Then she picked up her spoon again. She ate the 4th bite, the 5th, the 6th. She finished the bowl of goulash after it had gone cold, slowly, steadily, without haste, because she was hungry, and because of something else she still hadn't managed to name, yet it had already begun to sit beside her in the 4th empty chair at the table. The 4th week began with a spell of rain. November rain in Chicago, the kind that isn't heavy but never stops, the kind that fell over Lake Forest for 3 unbroken days, turning the stone garden and the bare oak trees north of the manor into a drenched gray-black painting that Thea looked out at from her bedroom window, as if she were looking at something of her own. On Wednesday night, the rain came down harder than it had on any of the nights before. Thea fell asleep after finishing Chapter 11 of the blue cloth-bound copy of Rebecca, leaving the brass lamp burning low beside her bed, and she woke at 3:54 in the morning, not because of the rain, but because of another sound moving up through the wooden floor from the level below to the foot of her bed. She lay still for 4 seconds to be certain. It was piano, not a modern recording. The kind of sound with a very thin layer of dust on the higher notes, the kind of dust that only lives on old shellac recordings played through a real turntable. She knew that melody. Gymnopédie No. 1 by Eric Satie. The piece her mother, on nights when she was lucid enough to remember her old habits, used to play on the old radio in the Pilsen apartment before going to sleep. Thea sat up, slipped on the gray wool robe, and went barefoot out of her room. The corridor in the west wing was darker than usual, because one of the brass wall lamps had gone out, and she had to walk more by memory than by light. She went down the main staircase. When she stepped onto the 7th stair, the wood beneath her foot gave a very slight creak, the kind of sound she had grown used to noticing in the Pilsen apartment, where every stair had its own voice. But here, in this gray stone house, she had imagined the floors would be completely silent. They weren't. She kept going. The piano grew clearer when she reached the 1st floor and turned into the west corridor. The library door stood ajar by about the width of a hand, and warm yellow firelight from inside cast a triangular strip across the deep red Persian carpet. Thea stopped about 2 yards from the door. She didn't push it open. She only leaned slightly to look through the gap. The library was large, with dark oak shelves on 3 walls rising from floor to ceiling across 2 stories, with a sliding brass ladder. The only light came from the stone fireplace where real oak logs were burning, and from a brass standing lamp beside a brown leather armchair. In that armchair, turned half toward the fire, sat Casper. He wore a black turtleneck sweater and black trousers, gray wool socks on his feet, and a low crystal glass of amber whiskey resting on the small table near his elbow. In the left corner of the room, on a low oak cabinet, stood an antique record player, a Swiss Thorens model from the 1960s, turning slowly with a black 12-inch record, the needle moving through the final groove of the first movement of Gymnopédie No. 1. Casper didn't turn his head when Thea stood in the doorway. He was looking into the fire. "You may come in, Miss Whitlock." His voice was low and even, not surprised. "I knew you were there from the 7th stair." Thea didn't startle. She had prepared herself for that from the moment she realized the stair had creaked. She pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The library floor was cool under her bare feet, but as she moved closer to the fire, the warmth touched her face like a thin cloth. She stood about 2 yards from Casper's chair and didn't sit in the second chair opposite him. Gymnopédie kept flowing, slow, hesitant, the first 3 chords of the left hand repeating like footsteps, waiting for a decision. "Who usually listens to this piece?" she asked. Casper lifted the whiskey glass but didn't drink. "My sister, Petra. She listened to this every night before she went to sleep." Petra. Thea remembered the name she had seen on the walnut door of the east wing the room that had been closed for 15 years. "My sister was born deaf," Casper said, still not turning his head. "She couldn't hear this piece the way you and I hear it." She put her toes on the wooden floor beside the record player, and she told me that Satie moved through the floor differently from Debussy, and Debussy differently from Chopin, and all 3 of them differently from the rain hitting the roof. She was 11 when she told me that. I was 20. I didn't believe her until she made me put my hand on the floor and count. Thea didn't ask anything more. She waited. "She went away when she was 11, Casper said. 15 years now." The 2 numbers, 11 and 15, fell into the library like 2 stones dropped into still water, and Thea felt 2 pieces in her mind meet and lock into place. 15 years since anyone had entered the room in the east wing. 15 years of silk scarves that had never been touched. 15 years of a man sitting alone at 4 in the morning letting a record turn. She took 1 more step toward the fire. She still didn't sit down. Casper turned his head for the first time since she had entered the room. She looked into his eyes in the firelight, and for the first time in 4 weeks since the night at the Drake Hotel, she saw that those eyes were no longer gray like steel. They were gray like Lake Michigan before sunrise, with a very thin layer of blue beneath. "My mother lost hearing in one ear when she was 8, Thea said. Her voice was soft but clear. "That is why I learned sign language, before I even learned English. We had an old radio in our house, and my mother used to play Satie's Gymnopédie on nights when she couldn't sleep. She said she heard half of it with her right ear, and the other half with her bones." Casper set down the whiskey glass. He said nothing for 10 seconds. Then he spoke, very softly, almost voiceless at the end of the sentence. "Petra would like you, Miss Whitlock." The record kept turning. Gymnopédie moved into its middle passage, where the melody in the right hand rises by half a tone and falls again, unresolved, unfinished. Thea remained in the library for another 8 minutes, without sitting, without leaving. She simply stayed there. Casper didn't touch her. He didn't invite her to sit. He didn't say another word after "Petra would like you." When the record finished the 3rd movement and the tone arm lifted on its own, Thea gave him the slightest nod and turned to walk out. When she returned to her room in the west wing, she locked the door from the inside, sat down on the edge of the bed, and she didn't cry. She only sat there, hands resting on her knees, and listened to the rain striking the arched window. 1 floor below her, in the 2-story library beside the burning fire, a man had just spoken the name he hadn't spoken to anyone in 15 years. And Thea, for the first time in 6 years since her own name had been torn into 100 pieces, was no longer alone inside her secret. On Friday morning, the week after the night of Gymnopédie, Elspeth brought a small envelope up to Thea's room, along with her breakfast tea tray. The familiar thick cotton paper had no logo, only 3 handwritten lines in the same hand Thea had learned to recognize. "Monday, 10 o'clock in the morning. Gus will pick you up. There is somewhere I want you to see before you ask me anything further. You may refuse, and I won't mention it again. KV." Thea read it twice, folded it, and set it down beside her teacup. She didn't refuse. On Monday, at 10 minutes to 10, the black Mercedes stopped outside the manor, and Gus was already seated in the back. He wore a darker gray suit than usual, and pinned to his breast was a small silver eagle badge Thea had never seen him wear before. "Miss Whitlock," he said when she slid onto the seat beside him. "Thank you for agreeing." The drive lasted 50 minutes. The car left Lake Forest, followed Highway 41 south, passed through the suburbs of Highland Park and Evanston, then merged onto Lakeshore Drive and headed along the edge of Lake Michigan into downtown Chicago. Gus said nothing for the first 30 minutes. Then, when the car turned into the west side beyond Ashland, he finally spoke. "The place we're going is called the Petra Foundation Center. It is one of 6 centers the Master has established over the past 10 years. 2 in Chicago, 1 in Milwaukee, 1 in Cleveland, 1 in Indianapolis, and 1 that opened last year in Minneapolis. All of them are for deaf children from families who can't afford special education. Tuition is free. Books, uniforms, lunch, and transportation are all free. The teachers are specialists in deaf education trained at Gallaudet University. There is no Varga name on any sign. There has never been a newspaper article written about these centers. The Master doesn't want that." Thea didn't ask why. She was beginning to understand. The car stopped in front of a 2-story old red brick building with a pale green front door and a sign that bore only 4 words, Petra Foundation, in brass letters gone slightly dull with age. Gus led Thea through a corridor tiled in white ceramic, through a pair of double doors, and into a glass-roofed courtyard. There, Thea stopped. The courtyard was about 100 square meters, with walls painted pale mint green, a floor of light oak planks, and a glass ceiling that allowed the natural light to fall through. Around the courtyard were open classrooms divided by glass, and inside them were children from 4 to 12 years old, drawing, doing math on whiteboards, practicing sign language with teachers. In one corner of the courtyard was a smaller area, with 2 easels and 3 low round tables, where a group of 6 children were coloring pictures with polychromos pencils, the exact kind Casper had left on Rowan's table during the first week. Thea counted at least 70 children in the building. Gus stood beside her, his hands folded behind his back, saying nothing. He let her look. A little girl about 7 years old, with blonde hair tied into 2 braids and a red sweater, broke away from the group and walked toward Thea. She stopped half a meter away, tipped her face upward, and gently took hold of Thea's wrist without fear. Then she let go and signed, slowly and clearly, the way a child would who had been taught patience very early in life. "Are you Mr. Casper's friend?" Thea lowered herself into a crouch so they were eye level. She nodded. The little girl smiled, 1 front tooth missing. "He comes here once every month. He buys us cakes. The kind with vanilla cream and strawberries in the middle. He doesn't talk much, but he remembers all our names. My baby brother is 3, and he still doesn't know how to speak with his hands, but Mr. Casper does. He sat with him and taught him hello." Thea didn't answer. She only raised her hand and signed thank you. The little girl gave her a ballet girl's bow, then ran back to her group. Gus and Thea remained in the courtyard another 20 minutes. A teacher passed by, nodded to Gus, and called him Uncle August. No one called her Mrs. Varga. No one knew who she was. She was only a strange woman Uncle August had brought there today. On the drive back to Lake Forest, the car moved slowly through the commercial district of Wicker Park, and Thea looked out through the window for a long time before speaking. "Mr. August." "Yes, Miss Whitlock. Is he a bad man?" Gus didn't answer at once. He drew a small unlit cigar from his breast pocket and held it between 2 fingers, a habit Thea had noticed in him from the first time at the Ivy Room. "My girl," he finally said, "there is no one in this world who is entirely good or entirely bad. People want to believe there is, but they believe that only because they haven't lived long enough. But Casper Varga has 3 iron rules." He raised his thumb. "Never anything involving drugs and children." Then his forefinger. "Never order an innocent person to suffer the wrong ending." Then his middle finger. "Never break a promise, whether it is made to a child or to an enemy." He lowered his hand. "I have been with him 15 years, since he was 20 and had just lost his sister. I have seen him make decisions I wouldn't repeat to my priest, but those 3 rules, I have never seen him break them even once. Not even when breaking them would have made life much easier for him." Thea didn't ask anything more. She only looked out through the glass, watched Lake Michigan sliding backward beneath the late November sun, and thought of the little blonde girl with braids who had said Mr. Casper bought vanilla and strawberry cakes, and thought of the silent piano of 15 years, and thought of the 3 rules a man had kept unbroken for 15 years. By the time the car reached the gates of the Lake Forest estate, evening was beginning to fall. Thea stepped into the main hall, took off her cashmere coat, and saw a handwritten note on the table by the door. 3 words. Thank you. KV. 3 nights after the visit to the Petra Foundation Center, Thea couldn't sleep. Not because of any storm. Not because of any sound from the floor below. She simply lay in her 4-poster bed, staring up at the ceiling, and realized that her mind had begun to work in a way it hadn't worked in 6 years. She was connecting pieces, and each new link pulled another behind it. At 1:18 in the morning, she got up, put on her robe, and stepped out of her room for no clear reason except that she couldn't bear to lie there 1 minute longer. She went down the stairs, avoided the corridor leading toward the library, and turned into the East Wing hallway. At the end of that corridor was Casper's study. She had passed that door every day for nearly 5 weeks. She had never opened it. Tonight the door stood slightly ajar. Warm yellow light spilled out from inside. Even Thea didn't know what she was looking for when she pushed the door and stepped inside. The room was large, with a high ceiling, 3 walls lined with black oak bookshelves, and a stone fireplace whose flames had died but whose coals still glowed. In the middle stood an old oak desk that had perhaps belonged to Casper's father and grandfather before him, its dark green leather top worn at the 4 corners. On the desk burned a brass reading lamp set low. A Mont Blanc fountain pen lay across one side, and an open gray stone-colored hardback file rested in the center. Thea stopped 3 paces from the desk. She looked at the file from where she stood. In the upper right corner of the first page was a logo she had not seen in 6 years, but would have recognized even if someone had cut it into 10 pieces and scattered them across a card table. A dark blue shield with 3 interlocked letters. HMI, Harrogate Mutual Insurance. Her heart went cold, not from fear, but from a feeling like dropping something into deep water and hearing no bottom. She walked to the desk, placed one hand on the edge, and looked down. The first page was a summary of HMI internal transactions from the second quarter of this year. Numbers, transfers, a row of shell company names in Delaware and Nevada that Thea knew so well she could have read them even upside down. At the corner of the chart was a small red stamp. Only 4 words. Level A retrieval. That wasn't the sort of document that left the company by ordinary means. It was the sort of document that existed only when someone had paid a great deal, or owed someone a great deal, to obtain it. She didn't hear the door open behind her. She only knew Casper was there when a shadow fell across the page beneath the reading lamp. She didn't close the file. She didn't flinch. She didn't know why she did neither of those things. Casper walked around the desk. He wore a white shirt with the top 2 buttons undone, black trousers, and gray wool socks. He wasn't holding whiskey this time. He wasn't angry. He pulled the second leather chair close beside the chair at the head of the desk, sat down next to her at a distance of a single handspan, and reached up to turn the next page of the file. Slowly, as though he were opening a book they had both read but had never read together. I investigated Cyrus Thorne for 7 years, he said, his voice low, not emphasizing a single word. He wasn't only laundering money for himself. He was laundering money for an organized crime network based in Detroit, using 72 large-scale false insurance claims over the past 8 years. Thousands of families in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan were robbed of insurance money they should have received when they lost homes, lost cars, lost family members. That money flowed into the Detroit network through shell companies. Thea no longer looked at the file. She looked at Casper. You know who I am. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Casper didn't take his hand off the file. 6 years ago, he said, I read an internal HMI investigative report, number 4471, signed by an investigator named Thea Whitlock, age 21. The report was 41 pages long. You went into the South Side to take testimony from a 9-year-old deaf boy who was the only surviving witness in an insurance fraud arson case. And because that boy refused to speak to any other company employee, you sat with him for 4 hours and took his statement in sign language. That report concluded that there was an internal chain-altering claim files in order to move money outside the company. Cyrus Thorne buried that report within 48 hours after you submitted it. 3 months later, you were fired under a fabricated accusation. I have kept a copy of that report for 6 years, Miss Whitlock. Thea felt something rising from her chest that she couldn't stop in time. He continued, very evenly. 1 year ago, I learned exactly what your life had become in the years afterward. I know your father died 2 weeks after you were fired. I know your mother began losing her memory the following year. I know you have worked 3 jobs over the past 4 years to pay $4,000 a month to Oakwood. I tried every way I could to approach you naturally for the past 10 months, but I found no way that wouldn't frighten you, wouldn't make you think I was using you. The night at the Drake Hotel, Rowan found you before I did. I don't know whether that was coincidence or not. I only know that after that night, I didn't need to find another way. Thea's tears fell onto the green leather surface of the desk. 1 drop, then 2. She didn't wipe them away. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. Because I wanted you to choose to stay because of Rowan, not because you wanted revenge against Thorne. If I had told you first, you never would have known what you chose for. And there is one more reason. Thea waited. Thorne has an information network throughout HMI and in 3 banks across the Midwest. Once you stepped into my house, he would know within 48 hours. That is why I assigned 4 of my men to guard Oakwood from the day you signed the contract. From before you knew who I was. Thea lifted her face and looked at him. Beneath the brass lamp, Casper's eyes weren't cold. Not steel gray. They were almost brown. Now you know, he said. What you choose to stay for is your right, Thea, not mine. Casper's private plane lifted off from Cleveland Hopkins Airport, 4 minutes after the call from the chief of security at Oakwood. He had risen from his seat in the meeting room before the report was finished, had reached the car before the call ended, and by the time his Gulfstream left the runway, the meeting he had walked out of was still frozen in place, every person sitting exactly where they had been. No one daring to continue because no one knew what to say when Casper Varga stood up in the middle of a sentence without explanation. 1 hour after the alarm sounded on Oakwood's 3rd floor, the black Maybach turned into the entrance through the ambulance drive. Thea was sitting in the chair beside her mother's bed, one arm holding Mira as she leaned asleep against her shoulder, the other hidden beneath the blanket so her mother wouldn't see the bruises. The head nurse on the 3rd floor, a woman named Noreen, whom Thea had known for 3 years, was standing in the doorway with 2 of the facility's security officers, all 3 of them silent after Casper's men had already handled their part and withdrawn through the side exit. When Thea heard footsteps in the hallway, she knew at once they didn't belong to anyone from the nursing home. The rhythm was too fast. There was no rubber sole squeak, no rattle of a medical cart. She turned toward the door. Casper stepped into the room, and for the first time in 6 weeks since the night at the Drake Hotel, Thea saw him as something other than the man in the doorway. His hair was disordered at the right temple, where the wind on the runway had blown it loose. His tie had been removed and stuffed carelessly into his coat pocket, the top 2 buttons of his white shirt undone, revealing part of his collarbone. The right sleeve had been rolled higher than the left by about an inch. His face was so pale that Thea could see the faint line of a vein running along his left temple. Something ordinary light had always hidden before. He looked around the room for 1 second. He looked at Mira sleeping against Thea's shoulder and saw that she was safe. He looked at Noreen in the doorway and gave her a single nod, enough for her to understand and step back to close the door. Then he looked at Thea, and his eyes stopped on her left arm hidden beneath the blanket. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to 1 knee. Not sat in the empty chair beside the bed. Not leaned over. Knelt, 1 knee braced, the other pressed to the vinyl floor. At exactly the height where his face was lower than hers, he reached out and, very gently, without gripping, only drawing, pulled Thea's left arm out from under the blanket. He turned her wrist upward. Under the hospital light, the bruised red circle with 4 ring marks stood out clearly against her pale skin. Thea saw Casper's right hand tremble. Not from cold. Not from exhaustion. It trembled from something he had not yet managed to control in the 17 minutes of flight from Cleveland. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice was rough, breaking on the word hurt, as though his throat had tightened in the middle of the sentence. "I'm all right," Thea whispered. "My mother. Is my mother safe?" "She is safe." Casper said those 3 words, and then stopped to draw a breath. "She is safe. From this minute forward, 4 men will guard her 24 hours a day. A doctor will sleep in the facility every night. There won't be a second time." He rose from the floor, still holding her hand, and then, very slowly, he helped her stand up from the bed, carefully so as not to wake Mira, and he embraced her. For the first time, not the embrace of a man holding a woman he had wanted to hold for 6 weeks, It was the embrace of someone who had spent 21 years refusing himself the right to be afraid, and had just found something that made his whole body give way by 1 degree. He pulled her against his chest, one hand at the back of her neck, the other around her back, and Thea felt his whole body shudder once, only once, very slightly. His shirt carried the familiar scent of cedar, the smell of cigar smoke he had taken on during the flight, and another scent that reached her more slowly. It was the smell of fear. At last, inside a man who had had no room for that scent in 21 years. Thea cried. She hadn't meant to cry. She had swallowed it down from the moment the alarm began. She only let the tears run into the fabric of his white shirt, and the cloth absorbed them, and she felt him hold her a little tighter. Casper whispered into her hair, his voice more visibly broken than in any sentence he had ever spoken to her. "I am sorry, Thea. I thought I had shielded you better. I was wrong." It was the first time in the 15 years Gus had worked for him, the first time in his entire life without a mother and without a sister, that Casper Varga apologized to another person with his whole throat. Gus stood outside the door, one hand resting on the handle, not looking into the room, not looking down the hallway, only looking at the floor and waiting. 2 hours later, when the last light of late November evening had spilled across Lake Michigan in a brief streak of orange, one of Casper's private medical convoys arrived at Oakwood. Mira was transferred on an electronic stretcher with full vital sign monitoring, a private nurse seated by her head, and a neurologist named Hoffman, flown in from Ann Arbor on Casper's orders, seated near her feet. She was moved into the private medical suite Casper's construction team had prepared in less than 24 hours in the south wing of the Lake Forest estate, in what had once been a small sitting room, and had now been fitted with a cardiac bed, monitors, oxygen support, and a connecting door to the room of a night nurse on duty. Thea sat beside her mother for the entire drive. Casper sat across from her and said nothing, but his hand remained over hers for all 45 minutes, and not once did he pull it away. Mira slept deeply on her first night in the new room in the south wing of the Lake Forest estate, breathing evenly beneath the low-powered medical lights, with Dr. Hoffman sitting in the adjoining room until 2 in the morning, before he would finally agree to lie down. The doctor confirmed that she had suffered no physical injury. Her blood pressure was stable. Her heart rate was only slightly above average, a normal response after such a sudden waking. He told Thea to go and sleep. Thea nodded, sat beside her mother's bed for another half hour, then went back up to the west wing. She couldn't sleep. She tried lying still for 40 minutes with her eyes shut, and her body answered by tightening in every place, where her left wrist had already darkened beneath the thin medical bandage the nurse had wrapped around it the afternoon before. She sat up, put on the milk beige cashmere coat and a pair of short leather boots, went downstairs, and stepped out into the east garden through the glass door of the small dining room. The east garden was smaller than the back garden. At its center was an artificial pond about 5 meters across, edged in gray limestone delicately cracked by the passing years. The surface had frozen beneath a thin, clear layer of ice. Around the pond stood 3 stone benches, and on the one facing the water, with his back to the manor, sat Casper. He wore a black wool coat that fell to his knees, the collar turned up, and in his right hand he held a slowly burning cigar, the smoke rising straight into the windless night sky. Beside him, on the stone seat, lay the gray wool scarf he had given her that night in the library the week before. He didn't turn his head when he heard her footsteps. He only reached for the scarf and set it on the bench to his right, where she would sit. Thea wrapped the scarf around herself and sat down exactly a handspan away from him. The two of them sat in silence for 5 minutes. The cigar burned past its halfway mark. The pond beneath the thin ice reflected cold stars in broken fragments. At last, Casper spoke. "Her name was Petra Zsofia Varga," he said. "Petra was my grandmother's name. Sofia was my mother's. She was born in June of 1999. I was 9 years older. She was born deaf in both ears. The doctors discovered it when she was 2 weeks old. My mother cried for 3 months before she could accept it. My father didn't cry. My father hired a sign language instructor from Gallaudet to fly to Chicago every weekend for 2 years and teach the whole family. I was 6 when the teacher first came." Thea said nothing. She listened. "For the next 10 years, Casper went on, Petra and I used sign language to tell each other the things our parents didn't understand. She loved birds. All birds. She knew the Latin names of 47 species before she was 10. She couldn't hear birdsong, but she could sit at the second-floor window and watch the tail of a mourning dove and tell me whether it was happy or sad just by the rhythm of its tail. She learned piano on the same Steinway in the music room downstairs, even though she couldn't hear. She placed her toes on the floor and felt the vibrations. She said Satie vibrated differently from Chopin. Gymnopédie was her piece. Casper fell silent. He lifted the cigar and tapped the ash into the small brass ashtray resting on the stone beside his foot. Acute myeloid leukemia was diagnosed when she was 8, he said. 3 years of treatment, 2 bone marrow procedures, 4 rounds of chemotherapy. Twice the hospital had nothing left to offer her. I sat beside her bed every day of those 3 years, Miss Whitlock. I learned to play gymnopédie so she could feel the vibration when I played and wouldn't have to depend on the phonograph. I didn't play it well, but she didn't need it to be well played. She only needed the vibration. Thea had begun to cry at some point without knowing exactly when, but she didn't wipe the tears away. On the last night, Casper said, his voice not breaking but thinned almost to transparency. She no longer had the strength to keep her eyes open for long, but she signed to me, very slowly and very clearly, "Don't be sad. I will be able to hear gymnopédie up there." Then she drifted to sleep. I was the only person in the room. 2:35 in the morning, November 23rd, 2010. Next week will make 15 years. Thea reached out with her left hand, the one without the bandage, and took hold of Casper's right hand. That was the hand holding the cigar. He let her hold it. "That is why you have never married," she said softly. "I don't want anyone to pay the price for my name again," he answered. "I saw my father pay. I saw my mother pay for 7 years after Petra went, until she followed her. I did not build a house to add another name to that list." "Then why me?" Thea asked. Casper was silent for a long while. Then he turned his head and looked at her, beneath the cold stars of Lake Forest. His eyes had no color at all. They were only the eyes of a man who had spoken something he had not spoken to anyone in 15 years. 6 years ago, he said, "when I read your report number 4471, I cried. For the first time since the night Petra died, a 21-year-old investigator named Thea Whitlock sat with a deaf boy on the south side for 4 hours and took his statement in a language that boy had believed no one in the insurance company knew. You didn't know me, Thea, but I had known you since that night." 3 weeks after the night in the East Garden, Mira had adjusted to the new room in the south wing of the Lake Forest estate. She was lucid enough to call Thea by name on 4 of the 7 days that week, and Dr. Hoffman said the stability of the environment was having an effect faster than he had predicted. Rowan had begun bringing his sketchbook into Mira's room every afternoon and sitting quietly in the chair beside her bed while she read. She couldn't tell who the boy was, but she liked him, and Rowan, for the first time in 2 years, had agreed to remain in the same room with an elderly woman who wasn't his mother. On the last Saturday morning of November, Elspeth brought to Thea's room a large cream-colored box tied with a gray silk ribbon and a smaller black box. Inside the large box was a dark blue silk dress from an Italian dressmaker in New York, simple in design, with a boat neckline, 3/4 sleeves, and a hem that fell just to mid-calf. In the smaller box, resting on black velvet, was a 3-strand Akoya pearl necklace in creamy white. The silver clasp softened by old patina, the kind of patina that only comes when a strand of pearls has been worn every day for years by the same skin. On the lid of the box was a folded note. 2 lines. "She would be happy for you to wear it. KV." Thea sat down on the edge of the bed, with the pearls in her palm. She knew what they were without anyone having to explain. The necklace had belonged to Petra Varga, and before that, to Petra's mother. She put it on, and the pearls touched her skin cold for a few seconds, before warming quickly. At 7:10 that evening, the black Maybach carrying Thea and Casper stopped in front of the Peninsula Hotel on the Magnificent Mile. This year's annual Petra Foundation Gala was being held in the Grand Ballroom, decorated in a Central European winter theme, with 7 baccarat crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, tables covered in ivory white linen, with real wax candles burning, white magnolias and silver pine branches arranged in the style of Budapest in the 1930s. When Thea stepped out of the car, Casper held out his hand, and she placed hers on the sleeve of his tuxedo at the elbow. They crossed the lobby, passed between 2 rows of formally dressed guests, and the conversation in the ballroom dropped by half a tone for a moment that only those accustomed to such things would have noticed. The first incident happened before they could even reach the head table. A reporter from the Chicago Business Review, a woman of about 40 with short red hair, black dress, and a microphone concealed in her palm, stepped out from the crowd and blocked their path with a practiced smile. "Miss Whitlock, do you have any comment on the reopening of the Harrogate Mutual investigation this week? 6 years ago, you were the first person to file an internal report on Cyrus Thorne, and your appearance tonight beside Mr. Varga, is it connected to?" Casper placed his hand over Thea's hand where it rested on his arm. He didn't look at the reporter. He spoke to Thea. "We should greet the governor first, sweetheart." Then he guided her onward without turning back. Thea felt herself let out a breath she hadn't known she had been holding. The second incident happened 20 minutes later, when Casper stepped away from her briefly to speak with the governor of Illinois and his wife on the far side of the room. Thea stood near the canapé table with a glass of champagne in her hand, and she realized she was being watched. A woman of about 65, wearing a diamond necklace so heavy it made her shoulders slope slightly, moved slowly past Thea and murmured just loudly enough for only her to hear. "The little thing climbed fast, didn't she? From hotel housekeeping to wearing the family pearls in under 2 months." The woman kept walking without pausing, as if the sentence were only a drop of wine she had flicked onto the floor and had no need to turn back and watch it fall. Thea stood still. She tightened her grip on the champagne glass so hard she worried the crystal might crack in her hand. She counted to 7 in her head. She didn't answer. She took one small sip of champagne, then a second. She didn't look for Casper, because she knew that if she looked at him right then, she wouldn't be able to keep standing straight. She decided to move toward the bar for another glass. She didn't know Dorian Halleck was standing there. The third incident began when Thea was about to set down her empty champagne flute on the white marble bar, and a man's hand, wearing 2 heavy gold rings, came down beside hers, blocking exactly the path she had meant to step back through. The man was about 6 feet tall, around 55, with salt and pepper hair brushed back from his face, cheeks flushed from drinking too early, and a black tuxedo with satin lapels. His eyes were cold and held the look of a man long accustomed to using that look to say the things he didn't bother saying aloud. He smiled. "Thea Whitlock." "Yes. You don't recognize me. That's all right. I'm Dorian Halleck, an old friend of Mr. Lejos Varga, father of the man standing over there speaking with the governor. I drank coffee with Lejos in this very hotel 20 years ago, before he passed. Tonight I am pleased, at last, to meet the woman who has managed to bring Lejos's son to a gala. There are a few things I have wanted to ask you from the moment I saw the pearl necklace you are wearing." Thea didn't take her hand away from the bar. She turned slightly so that she faced Dorian Halleck completely, cutting through the little space he had built around her, and making certain that whatever he did next would stay within her line of sight. In her right hand she still held the champagne flute, newly refilled to 2/3 by the bartender before Halleck had stepped in to block her way. She didn't raise the glass. She only held it, her thumb resting against the crystal stem. The young bartender behind the counter had slowed his movements, and Thea realized that at least 4 people within 15 feet had already understood that something outside the ordinary was taking place. Halleck took a swallow of whiskey and smiled, the kind of smile a man had practiced in mirrors for half his life. "You know, Petra once wore that necklace too. I remember it clearly. In 2008, at the Chicago Children's Foundation Gala, her mother, Zsofia, fastened it around the girl's neck with her own hands. Petra was 9 then, and all of us looked at her and thought that she would grow into the most beautiful woman in the Varga family. But only 2 years later, the girl had." He drew in a long breath through his teeth, deliberately stretching the moment. "Vanished for good." Thea lifted the champagne flute in a motion that was neither quick nor slow. She threw the rest of the champagne straight into Halleck's face. There wasn't much left in the glass, but it was enough for 2 drops to strike his forehead and the rest to run down his cheekbones, down his neck, and into the satin lapel of his black tuxedo. The small magnolia flower pinned to his buttonhole drooped within 3 seconds. The ballroom did not fall silent all at once. Only a circle of about 25 feet around the bar stopped first. Then the stillness spread outward as heads turned one by one, and over the course of about 4 seconds, the conversations in the room lowered the way a radio does when someone turns down the volume. The orchestra in the corner, which had been playing a Strauss waltz, stopped on the 12th measure and didn't move into the next. Halleck stood frozen. He didn't wipe his face. He didn't speak. He only blinked 4 times, and his mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, and Thea saw with perfect clarity the moment he realized he didn't know what to do next. because in 40 years of standing in rooms like this, no one had ever done such a thing to him. Thea set the empty glass down on the bar, precisely, atop a folded white linen napkin, without letting the crystal make a sound. Then she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. Her voice didn't shake. It had been forged cold by 6 years of doing work, in which no one ever looked directly at her face, and it carried clearly enough that even the woman in the diamond necklace, standing 30 feet away, had to stop breathing to listen. Mr. Halleck, if you mention Petra's name one more time in your life, in any tone other than absolute reverence, I will make certain that you are never invited to another event in this city again. Not here. Not at the Lyric Opera. Not at the Art Institute. Not anywhere there are still people who know the difference between red wine and floor cleaner. And when you go looking for God, in hopes of finding a seat at some table, I promise you that even God will be busy with other matters that day. Thea felt movement directly behind her, before Casper's hand came to rest on her back. Not on her shoulder, not on her waist. Exactly in the center of her back, the broad back of his hand laid flat there, the gesture of someone who had arrived less than a second before and had already heard the final sentence in full. He didn't say a word to Halleck. He didn't need to. 2 men in black tuxedos with silver cufflinks, the same men Thea had noticed in the lobby when they first arrived, appeared at Halleck's sides within 3 seconds, and one of them bent slightly to murmur into his ear, "Sir, we must ask you to leave through the side exit. Your car has already been called." Halleck opened his mouth one last time to say something, looked at Casper, and then his mouth closed again. He was escorted away without being touched, without being shoved, but with no choice left to him. The orchestra resumed the Strauss from the beginning of the phrase, 2 seconds late, and the ballroom went on. Casper bent close to Thea's ear. "Do you want to go home?" "Yes." They rode back in silence. In the black Maybach heading north along Lakeshore Drive, past the yellow street lamps sliding across the windows, Casper extended his right hand, palm upward, and rested it between them on the seat. Thea turned her left hand over, the hand that no longer hurt, and placed it in his. 15 years, Casper said. Not one person has defended Petra's name like that. Not even my father. At the funeral, not one of his allies stood up when an outsider said the girl hadn't been worth the money spent on her treatment. My father said nothing. My mother said nothing. I was 20, and I said nothing too. Thea looked out through the glass. She was worthy, she said. She did nothing wrong in the whole of her short life. She deserved to have someone stand up for her name. Casper turned his head and looked at her. The lights of Chicago moved across his cheek in intervals. Light and dark. Light and dark. You deserve that too, Thea. You always did. Thea didn't take her hand away. She didn't answer. She only rested her head against the leather seat, closed her eyes, and let her hand remain in his for the rest of the 47-minute drive back to Lake Forest. The week after the gala night passed in a different rhythm. Rowan began sleeping through the night without waking in terror, something his psychologist confirmed over a call from New York wasn't a coincidence. Mira was lucid 8 out of 10 days, enough to sit up and eat breakfast with Thea in the South Wing dining room 3 times that week, and each time she asked the same question about the primrose arrangement Thea had made for her, and each time Thea answered as though it were the first time. Thea came to understand that repetition wasn't loss. Repetition was a form of presence. On Thursday afternoon, Thea was walking back from the drawing room toward the West Wing to change her clothes after spending 2 hours with Rowan, and she passed the 2-story library. The door stood open by a narrow crack. Inside were 2 voices. Thea hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She stopped only because she heard her own name in the first sentence she caught. "We found him, boss," Gus was saying. "Tucson, Arizona. Has been there 4 months, hiding from 3 creditors in Phoenix and 1 in Las Vegas. Total debt is around $430,000. He's living in a 2-bedroom apartment beside the Greyhound bus station. A week ago, he lost his night security job." Casper answered after a few seconds. "Send him money." Gus fell silent. Thea didn't breathe. "Boss, this is the old friend who sold out Evander Whitlock in 2008. This is the same man who fed Cyrus Thorne false information so Thorne could fire Thea 6 years later. Evander Whitlock died before learning the truth. You know that. Why him?" Casper didn't answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was as even as always, but there was a finality in it that Thea had learned to recognize. Send $430,000 through a fake veterans charity in New Mexico. Make it look like a housing assistance grant for a former police officer in hardship. Make sure he never knows where the money came from. Have our attorney in Tucson check on him every 3 months, and make sure he doesn't die from drink or from having no medical insurance. Do not tell Thea. Gus. Why? Because her father loved him like a brother for 20 years before he betrayed him, and because Thea lost her father, lost her career, lost nearly all of her 20s. She doesn't need another death of someone who once mattered to her father on her conscience, not even the death of a traitor. Gus was silent for about 10 seconds. Then he said, very softly, in the voice of a man who had advised this man for 15 years, "You're in love with her, Casper." "I know." Thea turned and walked away as quietly as she could before she heard Casper answer that final statement, and she went down the corridor of oil paintings without remembering how she had walked, until she found herself standing in front of her own bedroom door in the west wing. She didn't go in. She stood there for 40 minutes. At 10:15 that night, after Rowan was asleep, after Mira was asleep, after Elspeth had turned off most of the lights on the first floor, Thea walked down the west wing corridor, past Rowan's room across from hers, and stopped before the walnut door at the end of the hall, Casper's bedroom. She had known the location of that door from the first night, but she had never walked toward it. She knocked 3 times. Not hard, not soft. The door opened after 2 seconds. Casper stood there wearing a white cotton shirt with the top 2 buttons undone, black trousers, gray wool socks on his feet, and in his right hand, an open book balanced against one finger midway through a chapter. He didn't look surprised, or perhaps he was, but he had already swallowed it before Thea could see it. "Why?" Thea said. There was no greeting. Casper knew what she meant without asking. "Because you deserve not to carry one more death on your shoulders." That was all he said. Thea stepped into the room. 1 step. 2. His room was darker than hers, lit only by a reading lamp at the bedside, and the air in it held the scent of freshly washed soap and the cedar of the coats in his wardrobe. She didn't look at the bed. She looked at him. She lifted her right hand and took hold of the edge of his shirt sleeve, not gripping, only holding, as though she needed an anchor point. She raised her face to him. "Casper Varga," she said. "Who are you?" Casper set the book down on the small table by the door, without looking where he placed it. He lifted his free hand and touched her cheek very lightly, his thumb brushing the line of her cheekbone that he had first seen in room 4721 at the Drake Hotel. "I am simply the man who loves you, Thea. Since 6 years ago. Since report number 4471. I was that man before I even knew your face." Thea pulled him down by the hold she had on his sleeve, and she kissed him. Not in haste, not possessively, not the kiss of 2 people trying to make up for anything. Only a quiet recognition, from both of them, that they had waited too long and had waited long enough. Casper's mouth was warm, and he didn't wrap his arms around her at once. He let her choose the pace. Only after Thea released his sleeve did he place a hand at the back of her neck, very lightly, as though he feared that if he held her more tightly, she might disappear. When they parted, Casper rested his forehead against hers. They stood like that for nearly a minute, saying nothing, only breathing. Outside his window, the first snow of December was falling over Lake Forest in slow white flakes. 3 weeks after the first snowfall, the Lake Forest estate had taken on a different rhythm. Mira ate breakfast with Thea 5 days a week. Rowan had begun carrying his drawings down to the music room, setting them on the stand beside Petra's Steinway, and continuing to draw there while Casper sat reading the newspaper in the armchair near the fire. The boy still hadn't spoken a single word aloud, but he had begun placing his hand on Thea's arm whenever she entered the room, a small gesture he himself didn't seem to realize he was making. Thea and Casper ate dinner together 4 nights a week, in the small dining room of the West Wing, not the main dining room. They still hadn't spoken of marriage. They still hadn't spoken of the future. They had only begun speaking of small things, and that was enough for both of them. The attack came on Monday morning of the 4th week, at 6:47. Casper was reading the paper when the first phone began to vibrate. He glanced at the screen, set down his coffee cup, and rose from the table with a nod in Thea's direction. "I will be in the library." 12 minutes later, Elspeth brought an iPad to Thea's room, already open to the homepage of the Chicago Tribune. The headline filled nearly the entire screen. Varga Corporation, accused of large-scale money laundering and financial fraud through Petra Foundation. FBI opens preliminary investigation. Beneath the headline was a photograph of Thea at the Peninsula Gala, cropped so that only her face remained under the crystal light, darkened 1 shade more than the original, with a bold caption beneath it. In what role has the dismissed former investigator returned? And is the woman wearing the Varga family pearls the same person who filed the report against Cyrus Thorne 6 years ago? Thea read the entire article in 11 minutes. She didn't drink her coffee during that time. She folded the iPad shut, set it on the table, and went to find Casper. He was in the library, standing beside the large desk, with 4 different phones laid out before him, while Gus was saying something into his ear faster than usual. Thea waited at the threshold until Casper looked up. For the first time in more than 3 months of knowing him, she saw something on his face that had never appeared there before. Not anger, weariness. An old weariness, the kind borne by someone who had known this storm would come, and still had to stand there and receive it on the exact day it arrived. He motioned for Gus to wait, stepped away from the desk, and came to her. He took her hand. "I can send you away," he said, his voice low. "Your mother and Rowan as well. Montreal. 3 houses in Outremont. The lawyers have already prepared everything. New identities for all 3 of you. A Canadian Sign Language teacher under another name. A 68-year-old mother under another name. A 9-year-old boy under another name. You leave within 48 hours. I prepared this plan from the first day you moved in, for the sake of this exact day. You and they will be safe there for at least 5 years, perhaps 10. Thea looked into his eyes, still holding his hand. "Will you go too?" Casper gave the slightest shake of his head. "I can't. If I leave, Thorne wins, and every other family will look and learn that the Varga syndicate can be pushed out of Chicago by a newspaper article. Thea, you have been running for 6 years. I won't force you to run one more day. Go." Thea tightened her grip on his hand. "I have been running for 6 years, Casper, since I was 21, when Thorne put my name in the papers in place of his own. I ran until there was nowhere left to run, and I found myself in room 4721 of a hotel, with a deaf boy clutching my wrist. I am not running anymore. Not from this house. Not from you." Casper looked at her for 10 seconds. He didn't argue. He only nodded once, very slightly. "What do you want?" "I want 2 hours, and 1 phone call." That same afternoon, Thea sat in a cafe in Gold Coast called La Colombe, at the corner of Dearborn and Goethe, at an old wooden table by the window beneath a low-hanging yellow lamp. Across from her sat a woman of 32, with black hair twisted low at the nape of her neck, wearing a navy wool coat that had seen many winters and low-heeled leather shoes of the kind worn by someone who had walked long miles through federal courthouses. Sienna Price, a classmate from Northwestern 6 years earlier. The 2 of them once interns together at Cook County in their 3rd year. The woman who had sent Thea white flowers on the day of her father's funeral. Now she was a senior litigator in the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, working financial crime and organized crime cases. Thea had not spoken to Sienna in 3 years. Sienna had answered the phone after 3 rings, asked when and where, and never asked why. Thea took a sip of black espresso and set the cup down. "I think I don't need to explain why I called you," Thea said. "No, I read the article this morning, Thea. I knew there was trouble again the moment I saw Thorne's name lying beneath Varga in the same paragraph. Every word in that article is false about Varga. But the FBI will still investigate, because someone wants them to investigate. That someone is Cyrus Thorne, and he is working with someone I did not know about until today." Thea opened her handbag and took out a small black USB drive no larger than the end of her thumb. She placed it on the table between them, not pushing it toward Sienna, only laying it there. Cyrus Thorne. 72 false insurance claims, from 2015 until now. Total value, $340 million. The money was withdrawn and routed into shell companies in Delaware and Nevada, then flowed into an organized crime network based in Detroit. The transfers went through 4 banks, one of them in Cyprus. The documents have been authenticated by 2 independent auditors. There is a long list of families who were robbed of insurance money, with their full names and addresses. Sienna looked at the USB drive. She didn't touch it. "Thea, if this is real, then it is a Pulitzer for some journalist, a chief prosecutor's office for me, and a federal sentence of no less than 25 years for Thorne. If it is false, all 3 of us lose our jobs. It is real. Every document has a timestamp, a retrieval chain, and a digital signature. I checked 3 times. I am giving it to you because I know you will read before you decide, and because I know you are the only person in the federal office in this city with a family member who once lost insurance money to one of Harrogate's false claims. Do you want the victory of the decade, Sienna Price? Sienna looked at her for a long time. Then she picked up the USB drive without asking another question and slipped it into the inner pocket of her navy coat. I will call you in 48 hours, she said. If I begin, there is no way back. I know, Thea answered. Sienna stood up. When she reached the door of the cafe, she turned back. Thea, it has been a long time since I received a case from someone who didn't ask me whether I could protect her first. Then she stepped outside. The small brass bell above the door rang once, and she was gone. Thea remained alone at the wooden table, watching the yellow light reflected on the surface of the cooling espresso, and for the first time since morning, she let out one long breath. Sienna called back after 31 hours. She had read every page, had 3 attorneys in the prosecutor's office verify the chain of retrieval, and had taken the full case file to the United States Attorney for the district. The office accepted it. The federal indictment would be filed in the Northern District of Illinois Court at 8 o'clock on Thursday morning. The arrest warrant for Cyrus Thorne and the search warrant for Harrogate Mutual Headquarters would be executed simultaneously. Thea's name would appear nowhere in the filing, as agreed. The source would be described only as a former internal employee who had voluntarily provided the documents after discovering new evidence. From the moment Thea hung up the phone until the indictment was filed, she had 29 hours. She and Casper left Lake Forest in the same black Maybach and drove to Varga Group headquarters on Wacker Avenue, a 50-story glass tower looking straight down over the Chicago River. Casper's office occupied half the top floor, with glass walls on 3 sides, a clear view of the river below half frozen beneath the December light, and at the center of the room stood a walnut desk that had once belonged to Casper's grandfather, when Varga Company had still been an import shop for paprika in Cleveland's Little Hungary district in 1956. The plan moved along 3 parallel tracks. The first was Sienna's indictment. The second Casper handled himself. He made 9 calls in succession to 9 families on the East Coast and across the Midwest, from Boston to Kansas City, each call no longer than 15 minutes, without Gus, without an assistant. He didn't ask them to do anything for him. He only shared a small portion of the case file, the part showing that Thorne had helped an organized criminal network in Detroit steal insurance money from thousands of families, including 23 families with deaf or disabled children. Those were 2 of the iron rules. Nothing involving harm to children, nothing involving the innocent. Thorne had violated both for 8 straight years. Thea sat on the black leather sofa by the window, listening to him speak in 4 different languages over the course of one afternoon, and she understood something she had not understood before. In this world, the law wasn't the strongest force. Rules were stronger, and when a man broke those rules before people who had lived by them for 4 generations, he lost the one thing that had kept him standing. The third track was Gus's. He didn't go to the FBI through the front door. He went through a former Justice Department lawyer who owed him a favor from 12 years earlier, and he submitted the full, clean transaction record of the Petra Foundation for the previous 7 years, independently audited by Deloitte, together with reports on the 6 deaf centers in 5 cities and a list of the names of 4,211 children who had studied in those centers. 36 hours. No one slept. Elspeth sent sealed meal boxes up to the 50th floor that no one touched. Mira was watched over at the estate by Elspeth and Nurse Noreen, who called Thea twice on the first day and once on the second. Rowan sat drawing beside Mira's bed. Thea fell asleep twice on the black leather sofa, each time for no more than 90 minutes. She woke with an ache in her back she had never known before, and with hair so tangled she didn't bother to comb it. At 3 in the morning on the second night, Thea was sitting on the sofa with a gray wool blanket over her shoulders, rereading the draft indictment on the tablet, when the office door opened. Casper stepped in carrying a tray. A white porcelain cup steaming with heat, a slice of toasted black bread spread with Normandy butter, and a small plate holding 2 peeled orange segments. He set the tray down on the coffee table in front of the sofa. "You need to eat." Thea looked at the cup. The scent of mint rose at once. The scent of leaves freshly cut the day before from the garden at the Lake Forest estate, by Elspeth's own hands. She picked up the cup. She picked up the bread. She ate the first bite. Casper sat down beside her on the sofa, tie removed, hair untidy, dark circles under his eyes. Thea chewed slowly. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "The first time I met you, Casper, I thought you were the coldest man in the world." Casper didn't smile, but one corner of his mouth lifted very slightly. "And now," Thea set the cup down, "now I think you are the warmest man I have ever met. It is only that you hid that warmth in a place no one dared to look." Casper looked at her for a long moment. Then he took her left hand, very slowly, and bent his head to kiss the knuckle of her index finger. He said nothing. He only set her hand back down on his thigh and kept it there. In the 34th hour from the moment Sienna filed the indictment, Cyrus Thorne was arrested by the FBI at Harrogate headquarters while he was in the middle of a quarterly board meeting. The headline ran on CNBC for 3 minutes. By the 40th hour, 6 of the 9 families Casper had called publicly confirmed that they would no longer do business with any link in the Detroit network. By the end of the 3rd day, 8 families had done the same. In the 42nd hour, the FBI officially withdrew its investigation into the Petra Foundation, and the director of the Illinois Department of Insurance issued a short press release announcing the reopening of Thea Whitlock's 2020 case, recognizing the conclusions in report number 4471 as accurate, and fully restoring her insurance investigator license, along with a formal apology. The next morning, the front page of the Chicago Tribune carried a photograph of Thea stepping out of Varga Tower, with Casper half a step behind her, and the caption had changed. "The woman who restored justice to 6 stolen years." 3 months had passed since the night Thorne was arrested. The Chicago winter had gone beyond its harshest point and begun to give way to March afternoons, when slanting light crossed the arched windows of the Lake Forest estate. Cyrus Thorne's preliminary trial had been scheduled for September, and Sienna Price had been promoted to Deputy United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois 2 weeks after the arrest. Thea's name was no longer in the papers. She had refused 4 interviews, including an offer of $60,000 from a national television network to appear in a long-form segment about the case. All she wanted was her investigator's license on her desk and the time to decide what she would do with it. That license now rested in an oak frame on the wall of her new office, a room Casper had renovated from a small sitting room on the 1st floor of the estate, where the windows looked out over the east garden and the small man-made pond now free of ice. Beside the frame stood the photograph of her father in his police uniform, and beneath it, Thea had removed the Harrogate termination letter from its old frame, cut it into 16 even squares, and pinned them to a small corkboard, like the pieces of something that no longer had any power over her. Mira had moved fully into the estate. The apartment in Pilsen had been bought by Casper from the old landlord, left exactly as it was, and maintained at his expense so Thea could return whenever she wished. Rowan, the brown-haired 9-year-old boy who had not spoken a single word in more than 2 years, had begun to speak again one Tuesday morning in the middle of March. The first 2 words he said, when Thea stepped into the drawing room carrying a pot of mint tea, were "Miss Thea." Thea had set the teapot down very carefully, crossed to him, and sat on the floor. He said nothing more that day, but he held her hand and kept it there for 20 minutes. Casper cried only once in the 4 months Thea had known him, and it was that night, in the library, after Rowan had fallen asleep. There was no sound, only one tear he did not wipe away, and Thea did not pretend not to see it. On the first Saturday night of April, Thea was in the drawing room with Rowan, showing him how to mix cobalt blue with a touch of titanium white to paint the surface of Lake Michigan at dawn. When Casper stepped into the room, he wore a black turtleneck sweater and gray trousers, his hair about half an inch longer than it had been in winter, and in his hand he carried an envelope made of thick cotton paper that Thea recognized at once, the same kind of paper as the card at the Drake Hotel, the same kind of paper as the 3 handwritten letters she had received over the past 4 months. Rowan looked up, understood without words, and slipped out of the room with a small, quiet smile. Casper laid the envelope on the drawing table. "Open it, Thea." Thea set down her paintbrush, wiped her hands on the linen cloth, and opened it. Inside were 11 pages fastened with a brass clip from the offices of Whitmore and Associates. On the first page, the title was printed in bold lowercase letters: Comprehensive Termination of Employment Agreement and Release of Obligation. Beside the packet, in a small envelope of gray tissue paper, was a J.P. Morgan bank check signed by hand in the amount of $1 million even, payable to Thea Eleanor Whitlock. Thea read to the 5th line of the first page, then stopped. She placed one hand on the edge of the drawing table. Her hand did not shake. She looked up. Casper did not look away. "You signed a contract with me 4 months ago because you needed care for your mother," Casper said. "In the 3 months since then, You have been through too much. A man came to the nursing home and threatened you. There was a gala night when someone used my sister's name as a weapon against you. There were 72 sleepless hours on the 50th floor of Varga Tower. I do not know, after those 3 months, which feelings are truly yours, and which feelings came because you were too exhausted to tell the difference. I am not permitted not to know that. Thea still said nothing. Over the past 3 months, Casper continued, since the night Thorne was arrested, you have had time to breathe. Your mother is better. Rowan has spoken your name. Your license has been returned to your hand. There is no storm moving over your head anymore. This is the moment when you may choose, truly choose, not in fear, not in gratitude, not because you have nowhere else to go. He touched the edge of the envelope, but did not take it away. You keep everything. Your mother stays at the estate as long as you want. If Rowan wishes to see you, you may come. The apartment in Pilsen is yours. In your name. Your license. No conditions. If you want to leave, I will walk you to the door, and I will never contact you again unless you want me to. I remain Casper Varga. You owe me nothing. Thea looked down at the papers. She looked up at Casper. She looked at Petra Steinway through the open doorway into the music room. Then she looked back at Casper. She took the 11 pages in both hands, very slowly, and tore them. One vertical tear, straight from top to bottom. Then she folded them in half and tore across. Then folded them again, and tore across once more. 64 pieces of white paper with black print fell to the wooden floor, some landing on the drawing table, one slipping into Rowan's brush-rinsing cup. Casper stood motionless. Thea took 2 steps toward him. She placed both hands against his chest, exactly where she had cried on the night at Oakwood, and lifted her face. Casper Varga, she said. I choose you. Not because of the contract, not because of my mother, not because of the apartment in Pilsen, not because of the license, not because of anything I might lose or keep. I choose you because I love you. I have loved you since the night I stood outside the library door and heard you play Gymnopédie on your sister's record player. Perhaps I loved you before that. I don't know. I only know that I cannot leave anymore, and I do not want to leave. Casper lifted both hands and cradled her face in them, and for the first time in the 4 months she had known him, Thea saw his eyes fill with tears. The wedding of Thea and Casper took place on the morning of the 2nd Saturday in June, in the east garden of the Lake Forest estate, with exactly 23 guests. Delphine Ashe, the owner of Petal and Pine Flower Shop, arranged the flowers for the ceremony with her own hands. 37 bouquets of white magnolias and deep purple lavender. Mira was brought into the garden in a wheelchair by a nurse, wearing a cream linen dress, lucid enough to call her daughter by the correct name and say that the groom looked like a decent man, though she couldn't remember how many times she had met him. Rowan carried the ring for Casper, and he read a short blessing in 2 sentences he had written himself, aloud, his voice still a little rough from being so little used. Gus served as best man. Sienna Price flew in from the federal office to attend and sat in the 2nd row. 10 months after the wedding, Spring had returned to Lake Forest for the 2nd time since the night Thea put pen to contract on the 32nd floor of the Aon Center. The cherry trees along the shore of Lake Michigan behind the estate had bloomed into a white veil, petals drifting slowly down onto the young grass and the surface of the man-made pond whose ice had melted back in February. Thea sat on the stone bench by the edge of the pond, a book half read resting in her lap, a cup of mint tea beside her on the stone. She wore a pale blue linen dress and a light cream sweater, her hair loosely tied at the nape with a black silk ribbon. There was no mark left on her left wrist, and on the ring finger of her right hand was a simple white gold band. About 8 yards away, Rowan was sitting and drawing with Gus at a wooden table set beneath a wisteria arbor blooming with purple flowers. The boy had grown another inch since the wedding day, his brown hair worn longer now and covering part of his ears, and he was wearing a new pair of round spectacles with brass frames that he had chosen himself in Chicago the month before. He rested his chin in his left hand, looked up at Gus, and said something aloud that made the silver-haired old man laugh so hard he had to set down his espresso cup to avoid spilling it. Behind them, the back door of the estate opened. Footsteps sounded on the garden gravel, light but familiar. Casper came to the stone bench carrying 2 freshly brewed cups of mint tea and sat down beside Thea. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, light gray trousers, and brown leather loafers worn smooth at the toes. He set one cup down beside Thea's old one and kept the other for himself. "What are you thinking?" Casper asked, in that familiar, low voice. Thea looked at Rowan, laughing with Gus. She looked at the cherry petals falling slowly across the pond. She looked at the mint tea in her hand and remembered a small white porcelain dish with a dried lavender stem resting on her bedside table in the West Wing room on a winter morning when she had thought her life was over. "I was thinking," she said. "Exactly 1 year and 2 weeks ago, I was sitting on the floor of the Pilsen apartment with no electricity, with a thick cotton calling card in my hand, and I thought my life had ended." Casper set down his tea. "And now I think my life has only just begun." Casper reached out with his right hand, and Thea placed her left hand into his. His hand bore faint calluses along the edge of his palm, the calluses of someone who had learned piano in the first 10 years of his life, so he could play for his sister and let her feel the vibrations through the wooden floor, and smaller calluses at the fingertips that Thea had once asked about, and he had answered, came from the year he turned 18 and began touching Petra's Steinway every night after the girl had gone. That hand closed around hers, not tightly, not for show, only with the quiet certainty of a man who had chosen and was sure. The wind from Lake Michigan moved through the garden, threading through the cherry blossoms and the wisteria, and from the east porch of the estate came a clear little sequence of notes from the brass wind chime Rowan had hung there 2 months earlier. That wind chime had belonged to Petra Varga. It had hung from that porch from 1999 until 2008, after which it had been taken down and kept in a pine box in her room. Rowan had found it 1 month after the night he first opened his mouth to speak Thea's name, had brought it to ask his uncle whether it could be hung up again, and Casper had sat silent for 5 minutes before nodding yes. Thea rested her head on Casper's shoulder, the shoulder she had cried into at Oakwood, the shoulder that had received her in the Peninsula lobby, the shoulder that had sat quietly beside her at 3 in the morning in the office on the 50th floor. From the window of the music room in the north wing, Petra's Steinway stood silent behind silk curtains that had been drawn open to let the light of May pour in. Every night since the previous winter, the piano had been played, by Thea, sometimes by Casper, once by Rowan, who had taught himself Gymnopédie No. 1 by Satie over 3 months with help from both of them, only so he could play it for his uncle on Casper's 35th birthday. Some people are born into power. Some people spend their whole lives fighting to win power. And there are some people, like Casper Varga, who were destined for power from birth and chose love instead. Thea Whitlock had once believed she lost everything on the night Cyrus Thorne signed the termination letter 6 years earlier. She had been wrong. She had only been finding, for the first time in the 27 years of her life, what she truly wanted. A gray stone home on the hill overlooking Lake Michigan, a little nephew who had found his own voice again, a mother cared for in a sun-filled room in the south wing, where she could look out over the garden every morning, a hand marked with faint calluses holding hers under the spring sunlight in the middle of a garden of blooming cherry trees. In the distant music room, Petra's old Thorin's record player stood silent, waiting for tonight when Rowan would, for the first time in his short life, lower the needle into the first groove of Gymnopédie No. 1 with his own hand, and sit listening to the vibrations through the wooden floor, just as Petra had once done 20 years earlier. Everything was real. Everything had been chosen. Everything, at last, belonged to them. If the story of Thea and Casper has touched your heart in any way, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video with those you love, who cherish deep and moving love stories, so that we can have more encouragement to bring you many compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Was there any moment in Thea and Casper's journey that left you still and speechless? Was there any line of Casper's that remained with you after the video ended? Please leave a comment below. We read every line, and we sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. We wish you, the one watching this video, very good health, a joyful life each day, and a spirit that remains peaceful among the simplest things around you. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.